Eugene Curran graduated from UCD in 1984, at a time when forest cover in Ireland was at a historic low, and the main way to drive up afforestation was for the state to acquire land and plant it.
I suppose at that time it was all state driven, and there was an acquisition department in the Forest and Wildlife Service, and they used to go out looking for land to plant, and very little was planted by farmers at the time. So it was a relatively, I suppose, straightforward thing for the state to do, to see a bit of ground, buy it and plant it. And then the foresters in those days tried to maximise the return to the taxpayer, and in many cases on poorer ground they would have planted Sitka spruce and lots of it on the side of hills, of which we see now. But in fairness to them, they did a great job in trying to maximise the return, because that was the most commercial way of a return from forestry at the time. Now, there were some absolutely fantastic amenities developed at the time. There would have been the likes of Gougane and Avondale, places like that. Forest parks were set up, so there was some super amenities set up for people then as well, and we still have the benefit of them to this day.
But as the state started to incentivise private landowners to plant trees, Eugene worked on developing those first schemes, and a strong focus on a commercial return for the farmer was always to the fore.
Yeah, I suppose there was a very strong focus at the time with the early grants and the schemes at the beginning was to grow commercially viable crops as fast as you could, and to try and get mixtures in place where broadleaves were growing to ensure that they grow up straight, and that there would be sufficient competition for them, so that the branching wouldn't be heavy, so there would be a reaching for the sky, as it were, you know. So with the conifers, there was 2,500 trees per hectare, and you would plant it on the poor ground. But that was, again, there was a kind of a commercial side to that farmers could see an investment going forward. Maybe in 30, 40 years they'd have their little nest egg when they'd retire or so, and they'd have a windfall, you know. So and it made perfect economic sense for farmers then and now to plant marginal land, because it was an investment in the future. With broadleaves, you'll still get a return from broadleaves, but it'll be longer. The rotations are longer. One way that we found that you could probably speed that up was by putting in mixtures of other species in, and that's what you have here. We have what is probably hybrid larch. European larch would be the sort of preferred, if you like, species in amongst oak, because Japanese larch would grow too quickly and would suffocate the oak. So you'll have to come in and you'll have to thin them. But that is a windfall then for the owner as well, financially, because the larch is a wonderful material for a number of different things, but fence posts they last a long time.
In a few years, we will come to a point when private woodland owners will have a bigger forested area than the state, and this has motivated the development of schemes like agroforestry.
This goes back to what I was saying. When I started out, it was the state that was running everything. Like, they bought a bit of ground, they planted. It was very simple, very straightforward. But now, because they're farmers, landowners, shrewd businessmen, they want to know how they can use that piece of ground, how they can, how those trees will enhance their land holding, how it will enhance their income going forward. And that's the whole point. The idea of agroforestry is trying to increase the options available to farmers, like that you have a number of different options available to a farmer to introduce trees onto a farm, that it isn't just a single narrow approach, that you would look at and sort of say, well, who are we aiming at for planting? And as farmers, it's so what can they do to what can they look to trees for? What is it in that the trees can do for their landholding? And there's so many things that the trees can do. One of the biggest ones, I think, is animal welfare. I mean, when you think about how animals developed, they didn't evolve in a shed or on a billiard table. You know, they had covered, or they had access to a certain amount of cover, and that's what trees will provide. So even though you have the agroforestry plantation that Ross has established so well out there, and it's in an establishment situation, I would see actually woodlands like this being used for agroforestry too, going down the road, that where you'd thin it out into such a situation where you could identify your final crop trees, protect them, and then introduce animals in a regulated, very regulated way, so that once the premiums are finished, because after all, that is when it is over to the landowner. It's his asset, it's his or her property. So it's up to them then to decide what to do with it.
Rossa Gibbons is one farmer who has embraced the scheme and sees the benefit it offers his livestock. Eugene knew when he was developing the agroforestry scheme that there would be farmers like Rossa looking for these options.
Yeah, I suppose when I started looking into it originally, I suppose it was going back maybe 10, 11 years ago, people were kind of thinking, you know, why would you plant a tree in a perfectly good field, you know? And I always felt there were going to be a lot of people out there that just understood what agroforestry could do, all the ecosystem services that Ross has been pointing out. The water protection is huge, because most of the planting will be done with broadleaf species, which will have a taproot, will bring the water right down, filter it out, so when it comes into the water courses it'll be crystal clear. Hopefully that's what trees do. So even in a normal plantation, like, well, not commercial plantation like this, that's what they're doing as well. Then you have all the bird life and the insects and so on, and the landscaping, and they are actually wonderful places just to walk through, you know. And I think a lot of farmers are going to look and they sort of say, well, what is this going to do for my landholding? And if it was only just a place that it would be pleasant to walk through, sure, wouldn't it be nice? And sure, the animals would feel the same way. Sheep, small calves and poultry.
The parameters of the scheme at the moment are very simple, but Eugene says that careful planning is needed by the farmer to ensure that the objectives of the farm and the animals are being met.
A minimum of 0.5 hectares and 20 metres wide. They're two the basic kind of factors, but you also have to have a minimum of 400 trees per hectare. That is, if you were to plant them singly, they'd be at 5 metre spacing apart. And even at that, you can get machines through. There was a landowner in Clonakilty who was able to cut silage from that spacing, but he did say that he would have preferred probably to do what Rossa was doing and planting them in rows, so that it would give them greater manoeuvrability. For some, 400 trees is too little. There's some poultry farmers, for example, who would prefer more trees than 400 trees. So we kind of sort of say between 400 trees and 1,000 trees per hectare to give people that flexibility.
The agroforestry scheme is in its early days. Both tillage and livestock farmers are seeing the benefits that it offers, and Eugene fully expects that as our understanding and culture around woodlands evolves, so too will the scheme.
So what we're hoping to do is explore a thing called forest farming, which is a form of agroforestry where you allow animals in, certain numbers of animals for a certain duration and with a certain area available to them. And this is something that we might develop as a pilot project going forward to learn just what is the best approach for Ireland in situations like this.
And so that approach would be looking at like stocking density, all the kind of, of the animals that you'd allow in,
Yeah.
how much area and all that time. So it's
Yeah.
all the language that the farmers are used to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's not limited to animals either. Like, you could have beehives in here. You could have, let's say, growing berry bushes or fruit trees or nut trees in amongst the trees. You could actually have all of these things happening in amongst the trees as the trees are growing and putting on the timber as they would. You'll have all these other activities going on too. So they're the kind of things I think we'd like to see farmers exploring, and we would be, I suppose, at a stage where a couple of pilot projects where we would have maybe demonstration days where farmers could swap experiences, and then we could see and have a better idea of how we might develop this further going forward. Because it's very important that we give the best advice to farmers, that we don't say just let in loads of pigs and let them off for any amount of time. You want to give them the best advice.